So everything at the beginning of Unit 3 has been discussing different ways in which we can cause natural populations to have lower reproductive rates or to increase their mortality rate or be less able to utilize their natural habitats. And when that happens, a species will be facing crisis. It's going to be, their population is going to be decreasing to the point where they are facing possible extinction. When a species is facing crisis, they have the option to perhaps adapt to the changes in the environment through natural selection, through evolution. However, that takes a very long time. Natural selection happens gradually through thousands of generations, millions of years. So at the pace at which habitats are being destroyed, at which pollution is put into these natural areas, at which invasive species are being introduced and are able to spread and take over an ecosystem, natural selection is not really a solution to this issue. You can't just adapt and evolve and deal with it overnight or in 1 or 2 generations. That takes a very long time to do. So that's out. Another option is to migrate to a new geographic location that is more suitable to your lifestyle, but globally, all ecosystems are being affected by human actions. So that's not much of an option either, especially since no matter where you go, you're going to face similar competition and similar environmental damage from habitat destruction and pollution and invasive species and all these other things. So there's a little bit of this, right? There's a little bit of adaptation. There's a little bit of migration to try to deal with any kind of circumstances that come through. But the last option available to you, if your mortality rate is higher than your birth rate, is going extinct. Now, there's a couple of different ways that a species can go extinct, different definitions of extinction that we can apply. Usually, what we mean when we say a species is extinct is that it is biologically extinct. It ceases to exist on a global scale. There's no more of that animal. The Tyrannosaurus rex is globally extinct. It is biologically extinct, right? It's gone. There's no more T-Rexes anywhere. You could also have an organism, though, that isn't like they still exist. There's still 1 or 2 laying around, but they're ecologically extinct. They're present in such low numbers that their effect on the ecosystem is frankly irrelevant. We talked earlier about how every organism in an ecosystem has a niche, a job, a way that they fit into that ecosystem. At a certain point, if the number of if you only have 2 or 3 members of that species in that ecosystem, they might be able to survive in the ecosystem, but they're not fulfilling the role in the same way, right? If you were to remove those last few individuals, it's no longer going to have the same effect as removing the first, 99% of the population did. So they're extinct in a practical sense. They are ecologically extinct. The damage is already done. Now, that species, however, can still recover at that point. So there is a strong distinction here between biologically extinct and ecologically extinct. Since an ecologically extinct species still has some members around, we could save it. We could still recover it, but it may not be a strong participating member in its ecosystem anymore. And then there's species that are locally extinct. So that means that there might be many populations of a given organism. Typically, organisms live in kind of clusters, in patches, right? They don't just live absolutely everywhere in a big geographic region. There are specific areas like little edges of forest where they do well, and the edges of forests aren't continuous, so you'll have a patch of a population here and a patch of a population here, a patch of a population here. You'll have some in Pennsylvania, maybe you have some in Delaware, you have some down in Maryland, and you could have a situation where some environmental disaster comes through and completely wipes out one subsection of the population, say all of the members of that population in Maryland, and they would become locally extinct. They are extinct in that region, even though other populations still exist elsewhere. So that is another sense in which we use the term extinct to mean locally extinct. Another way to say that is extirpated, which I think I have on one of these slides in the future here. Up here on the slide, I have a passenger pigeon. This is a species of bird that is native to North America, and they existed in enormous numbers. There are writers that describe flocks of passenger pigeons, and when the passenger pigeon flies overhead, when the flocks fly overhead, the cloud of them is dense enough that it blots out the sun. It's like suddenly a storm cloud has just passed by, right? We're in sudden bright sunny day, suddenly shade. That's how thick the sky was with these things when they passed by. But when European settlers came in, they hunted them for an easy source of food, because look how abundant it is. You don't even have to aim your shotgun when you're aiming up into that cloud. You just fire up into the air and bam, they come right down. And also, we obviously built a lot of cities. We needed a lot of lumber. We really ramped up the amount of deforestation when European settlers came through, and that destroyed a lot of their habitats. So all of the factors that we talked about previously that cause humans to affect biodiversity, they had an intense effect on these passenger pigeons, over-harvesting and habitat destruction, all of this. And the last passenger pigeon died in 1901. It was an incredibly rapid turnover from being such an abundant species that the clouds of them can blot out the sun to all gone, completely biologically extinct in just that short period of time. Now, not all extinctions are caused by humans. Species have been going extinct for a very long time. And I mentioned Tyrannosaurus rex earlier. That is a dinosaur. Dinosaurs went extinct before humans ever arrived. You know, the only mammals around at that time were tiny little mouse-like guys kind of scurrying around. So extinction is a normal process that happens at a certain rate. Some species will go extinct, and this is counterbalanced by evolution, which creates new species over time. As a population grows and spreads, it moves into different areas, different ecosystems, and there are going to be different requirements, environmental requirements in each of those locations. So adaptations in one location will vary from another one, and that's how you can get different species developing from one source population. So evolution creates new species, and extinction removes old ones. And if you look at the fossil record, what you actually see is you have points where there's actually a relatively small biodiversity of species, very small number of fossils. And then you'll have periods where there's rapid diversification, lots and lots of new species coming out, right? Species that have never been seen before on Earth showing up in shallower and shallower layers. The deeper you go in the fossil record, the older it is. So newer types of species show up in shallower layers of rock, in newer rock. And you see more diversification, more diversification, more diversification, more and more species. So evolution is moving faster than the extinction rate. It's producing more species faster than they can go extinct. And then what you'll see is a plummet in the number of species. Suddenly, large numbers of species will be wiped out. And then from that tiny remaining population, or a small number of populations, you'll see diversification take over again. And you'll see a rise in biodiversity, and then a drop in biodiversity, and a rise in biodiversity, and a drop in biodiversity. And those sudden drops are what we call mass extinction events. So the normal rate at which species go extinct, that just at any given time in Earth's history, is referred to as the background extinction rate. And we try to calculate it based off the fossil record and based off what we can observe in natural habitats and a number of different calculations. Kind of a hard number to definitively pin down, but we do our best to come up with an unbiased quantity for this number. It's the rate that of extinction that existed before the human population became significant, though. That's what makes it hard to calculate, is that we only have experience with a world where humans exist. A mass extinction event is when there's a significant rise in the extinction rate over a period of time, a relatively, in geologic history, short period of time, which could be, thousands of years in geologic time. That's short. So if you think about, I think everyone knows about the idea of this asteroid that hits the Yucatan Peninsula, and that's what does in for the dinosaurs, right? I think Land Before Time showed us that, and they talk about it in Jurassic Park and probably lots of other nature documentaries you may have seen over the course of your life, right? They always show like the comet coming down, usually hitting like right next to a T-Rex and wiping everyone out. What actually would have killed most of the dinosaurs would have been the debris that was kicked up into the atmosphere, which causes less sunlight to be able to get through. So much dust and debris up in the atmosphere kind of creates a shade blanket around the Earth to such a degree that it reduces photosynthesis rates and it cools off the Earth and shifts the climate. And as a result, all of the adaptations, all of those species were adapted for a fundamentally different ecosystem than the one that suddenly began to take form. So, if you are not adapted for the ecosystem in which you find yourself, you are not going to be a very good competitor, and a lot of species ended up dying. So that stuff we talked about early on with biodiversity and evolution and competition, it's related to this content as well. You have to be well adapted to the environment in which you find yourself. And that's part of the reason why mammals took off so well. They had small bodies, they had warm bodies, they had a lot of adaptations that made them really good and able to thrive under certain conditions that emerged. In addition, all of their competition kind of got wiped out. But I digress. You have the background extinction rate and you have the mass extinctions. There have been 5 major mass extinction events in Earth's history. In Earth's geologic history, I should say. Now, up here I have a chart, and this is ways in which we can rate species in terms of how close they are to extinction. So, the easiest one to understand is extinct, right? Usually that means biologically extinct. Extinct in the wild means that there's still members of that species around, but they are all in zoos, they are all in captivity, or they are perhaps in wildlife preserves, but they don't live in their natural habitat anymore. In earlier slides, I showed you the Tasmanian wolf, the thylacine, is a marsupial predator that lives in Australia or lived in Australia. The last member of that species was held in captivity in someone's backyard for, I think, a couple of years, if I remember correctly. And so it was extinct in the wild, but it still existed until it died in a particularly cold winter. It was left outside, and then it became fully extinct. Now, we have the middle category here, which is all considered threatened species, which means that they are in danger of becoming extinct. CR stands for critically endangered. These are the ones that we are the most concerned about, the ones that are on the very precipice of going extinct, the ones that need the most conservation effort in order to try to preserve. Endangered species also very, very important to preserve because they are very close to becoming critically endangered. So their populations are low, but they are not at risk of maybe going extinct this week, but perhaps in the next few years they will be extinct, like very short time period. A vulnerable species has a population that's been declining typically, or it only exists in one subpopulation. So there's only one place where this population exists, and therefore if anything happens to that one location, that population is at risk of being wiped out. So it's become extinct in all these other locations, but it still exists in just one spot. There are a number of different factors. It's actually a very long list of criteria that you use to evaluate whether a species is endangered or not. But we have 3 stages of threatened: critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable. And that's what this is showing. Near threatened means they didn't quite make the list for threatened, but their population has been noticeably declining. So they're on a watch list. They're something that we're a little bit worried about, but we're not going to spend necessarily conservation funding worried about them just yet, because there's so many other species that we are concerned about. And then least concern, which is species that we don't need to expend any conservation effort in order to try to keep their numbers up. They are doing just fine. Squirrels in Pennsylvania are a species of least concern. No one's concerned about squirrels going extinct anytime soon, right? Dandelions are a species of least concern. They're not going anywhere. So that is the scale. Is another example of an extinct species, a giant ground sloth. These are part of the reason why we have avocados. They co-evolved with avocados. You ever notice that giant seed that avocados have, that big chunky thing that you have to kind of excavate with a spoon when you're cutting into an avocado? Well, seeds are meant to be eaten by animals and then distributed through their feces, right? That's how fruit trees reproduce. So what animal can possibly swallow that big honkin' seed right there and distribute it? Well, none that are currently alive, but this giant sloth used to eat a diet of mainly avocados, or at least a lot of avocados, and those seeds would go through its digestive system, and it would deliver them all over the place. So there is this big ground sloth, just a magnificent mammal that used to exist. No more. I think that's just kind of wonderful and fantastic. So I said there are 5 mass extinction events in Earth's geologic history. Many naturalists now argue that we are currently undergoing the 6th mass extinction event, which is driven primarily by human-caused factors, all those factors that we discussed in the first several videos of Unit 3. The reason being is that the background extinction rate is substantially higher than it would be without human activity. This figure that I have here, I think I took from your textbook, which says it's about 1,000 times higher than the background extinction rate. I've seen other estimates that say 100 times higher, so 100 to 1,000 times higher. We lose species every day. I've seen some estimates that say 10, 20 species per day, others that say 100, 150 species per day. The reason why there's so much variation in these estimates is because they all have to be based on computer modeling, based on sampling rates, and those samples have to, those models have to make certain assumptions about the data that we are using. Essentially, we don't know how many total species there are. And therefore, when we are aware of species and they go extinct, we know that that is a sample of a much bigger number of species, and that there are species that are going extinct every day that we are not even aware of. So we need to use some very clever statistics to come at these estimates. And the way math works is that you have to sometimes set down a few basic assumptions and then you let your computer run these models. So there's variation in these predictions. However, whether it's 100 times or 1,000 times higher than the background extinction rate or somewhere in between, it is a lot. We are losing a lot of species every single day. And this is what a mass extinction would look like. It's like I said, the asteroid didn't hit and all the dinosaurs died all at once. It changed the climate, and then over thousands of years, it slowly changed the conditions of competition such that many species went extinct. This is about the pace that a mass extinction would occur at, what we are experiencing right now. So this is why a lot of ecologists would argue that we are experiencing the 6th extinction, and this is a book that cites this thing. It's titled The 6th Extinction, and makes some arguments to that effect. Now, on each of these slides, I'm tossing in another endangered species or extinct species. This is the West African black rhino, which went extinct in 2006. from poaching and habitat destruction and all these kinds of factors. And it's not just the West African black rhino that was in danger of extinction. Many different species of rhinoceros have numbers that are frankly dwindling. So you can see here there are other species of black rhino. Right? This was specifically the West African black rhino that went extinct. But as you can see from this map that shows populations of other rhinos, the black rhino population here in Central Africa, about 5,000 to 5,500 black rhinos total. That is a population that is vulnerable to habitat destruction and poaching and could easily be depleted down to extinction. Think about how many elephants would have had to have been poached in order to create that giant stack of ivory that we saw on the overharvesting video or the overexploitation video. That number of rhinos, if they killed a similar number of rhinos, that would be a significant percentage of this population total. White rhinos, a little bit better population numbers, but still 20,000. That's not huge. And then you have on islands, on Sumatra and Java, you actually have very small island rhino populations. And I mean that in two senses of the word. One, it's a very small population with only a few dozen members of the population. These are areas where forest fires, Sumatra in particular, the rainforest is burned down to create palm oil plantations, and that's where these rhinoceros live. But they're also very small rhinoceri. I think it would be fair to say that they're about 2/3 the size of a normal rhinoceros, so they are very cute. If you ever get a chance, look up Sumatran rhino. Actually, just pause the recording for a second to double check. And the World Wildlife Fund currently has their population at less than 80 Sumatran rhino. So the numbers on this map are actually a little bit outdated. These populations have decreased somewhat since this was made. And lest you think that having some of these species in zoos and preserves is keeping them empirically safe from poachers, this is an article from 2017 about poachers breaking into a Paris wildlife preserve in order to kill rhinoceros for its horn. So again, these large criminal poaching cartels will find ways in order to get these exotic animal parts, regardless of what circumstances are in front of them. So on this next slide, we have 3 species of different statuses that are all from Pennsylvania. 1, we have the least shrew, which is a rude name, but it's called the least shrew, and it is locally endangered. It has populations elsewhere, but it is at risk of becoming endangered in our area, and that is due to habitat fragmentation. And if you recall from earlier, habitat fragmentation means that we have built roads and we have built like housing complexes and other types of things, cutting the natural habitat, say the forest habitat or field habitats, into smaller and smaller pieces. Right? We just leave behind these little patches of natural habitat. And the parts of the habitat that a species needs might be now located in different patches. So they need to cross through what's called the matrix, the human territory, in order to go from point A to point B to point C back to point A. So that is very, very dangerous for them. So habitat fragmentation is a big problem for these least shrew, particularly if they need to mate. If they need to find mates, they're going to need to travel around to look for them. Next, we have the piping plover, which is that's a fun name to say, but it has been extirpated. Extirpated is another way to say locally extinct. So there are populations elsewhere, but this lived in the Great Lakes region, up in Lake Erie, around where the beaches are, and it was a bird that buried its eggs in the sand. And there's a large tourist industry around the Great Lakes, and a lot of it is ecotourism, people who are going to do bird watching, people who are going to see nature, to see the Great Lakes and all of that. So somewhat ironically, having rare species, or a species that's kind of rare in that area, like the piping plover, caused more tourists to be coming out to go look for them. But then as they were walking along the beach, they inadvertently ended up crushing the nests. And it's not just ecotourism. Obviously, there's tons and tons of foot traffic around the Great Lakes, so all kinds of tourists. But that essentially was what drove their population down. The adults weren't being hunted or anything like that by humans, at least to the best of my knowledge. But if a species cannot reproduce itself, if it cannot make new members of the species, well, then when the adults die off, well, obviously, if the birth rate is not equal to the mortality rate, eventually the population is going to decline. And lastly, we have the peregrine falcon, which was endangered but is now recovering in population. And this is a large predatory bird. And the reason why its numbers were so low was because of a pesticide called DDT. So this is a history lesson. Go back to the 1970s. We have this product, DDT. It kills insects. Farmers are using it on all their crops. They're spraying it to get rid of all of the pests that are eating away at their crops. That's good for the farmers. That means that they get more of their crops that can go to market, make more sales. DDT, awesome. Tested it. We thought it was relatively safe for ecosystems, for animals, at least based on the tests that we were using or the requirements that we had in terms of regulations at that time. It passed. But here's what happened. Farmers were using it all over their crops, and there's a lot of farmland in the United States. And all of those insects were absorbing some of this DDT into their body. And this is a kind of poison that sticks in the tissues of your body. It doesn't just get washed out like other types of nasty things might. It'll bind to some of the tissues in your body. So when predators, like insect predators, right, like a spider or something, would eat some of these other bugs, it would need to eat several of them in order to fill its diet, to meet its calorie needs. So all of the poison that those insects had absorbed would then be transferred to the spider, and since it sticks in your tissue, like all of the poison that was in them now was inside the spider. So the spider actually had a higher concentration of the poison than the insects that it was eating. And then birds, smaller birds, would eat the spider, and then they would have to eat several of those in order to survive, right? So all of the poison from all of their food is coming up, but all of the spiders had several insects in theirs. So imagine like a pyramid, a poison pyramid, if you will, where you have all the farmers spreading all of this poison all over the place, and all that poison is slowly moving up a food chain, and it's becoming more and more concentrated at every step up the food chain that we go. And this is called biomagnification. And much like when we were talking about energy flow diagrams, this is Unit 1 stuff. This is the last video of Unit 1. We were talking about energy flow. And this peregrine falcon was one of our top tier predators we were talking about, right? And we said it needs lots and lots of territory because all of the photosynthesis, the energy that needs to be absorbed from sunlight, from those large stretches of territory, it needs to be captured and then transferred to the herbivores, who then transfer it to the carnivores, who then transfer it up and up and up, and eventually to this peregrine falcon. That same mechanism is transferring now all of that poison, which binds to the tissues, up the food chain. So the DDT was in its highest concentration in the top tier predators. It was intended for the insects, but it was getting concentrated through food chains to the top tier predators. And that was the raptors, the predatory birds. So this wasn't just peregrine falcons, this was bald eagles as well. Now, it didn't poison the birds. What it did was it altered their physiology slightly, and it caused them to produce eggs with thinner shells, very thin-shelled eggs. And everyone who knows anything about birds, how does a bird incubate their eggs? They sit on them. So what was happening was the birds were laying eggs, and as they were trying to warm them up, they were crushing their own nests. They were crushing their eggs. And just like with the piping plover, if a population cannot replace itself because they are not getting any new offspring coming in, then slowly that population will deplete over time. So we started to notice fewer and fewer birds of all kinds, but in particular these large predatory birds like bald eagles and peregrine falcons and the like. And this is one of the things that drove the American environmental movement. I think I've mentioned it before, but a woman named Rachel Carson wrote a book called Silent Spring, noting the complete absence of songbirds in certain areas, so Silent Spring. And it became a very well-read book, and it really catalyzed the movement for more environmental regulation and not allowing chemicals like this to be used, and DDT is now banned. So there was an environmental problem. We realized it was an environmental problem. We got public action behind it. We changed the laws, increased the regulation, or created smart regulations to deal with it, and then the populations recovered as a result. Beautiful example of the system working correctly.